Welcome in. Talking about a topic that we haven't quite gotten to yet, and that's because the war in Iran is obviously in its infancy. At least I think it's in its infancy, and we're not going to necessarily be done with this anytime soon. Maybe it's victory achieved and we back away. In the best case scenario, everything just starts humming along and functioning like a functional society with no follow-on issues. I am a skeptic. I'd be curious to get your thoughts, and you can drop those down below. But we did a newsletter on this, and this is the US base problem, which I think might rear its ugly head at some point in the near future. Realizing that the United States, we have had military bases in the Middle East for quite a while, and we have a lot of them, some being more permanent built up bases, other ones down to more or less an outpost. But by having a foothold in the region, it obviously gives the United States the ability to quickly surge in the region, conduct operations that are critical of national importance to the United States and our strategic plan. But ultimately, these nations have allowed us to operate here because it's a win-win for both parties for the most part. So the US military operates roughly 19 sites across the Middle East, 8 of which are considered permanent. These are the big bases that you might see, such as Udeid Air Base, which is, and I use in quotes, the crown jewel. I did put in the newsletter the 1-star review on Google of Udeid, which I don't disagree with, having spent just a short stint there myself, only 3 weeks as a liaison when I was last deployed. This is a big hub for U.S. military operations, and it's home to the CAOC, and that's the Combined Air Operations Center. You typically see a lot of tanker aircraft and cargo aircraft that are operating out of this facility, as well as the B-1 has been operating out of this for quite some time. Now, the Iran conflict has changed all the force laydown drastically, but if we looked at Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Inherent Resolve, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that's typically what went on here. Udeid home to 2 runways, big runways of that, 12,000 feet, and over an $8 billion investment by Qatar since 2003 specifically, just to keep and attract U.S. forces. Now, the U.S. does pay a lease to have this as well. So it is a two-way street when it comes to this. But regional security, you had deterrence through presence. The idea being if you could see us, then you're not going to mess with us and you're not going to mess with our friends. Now, around the region, you have a couple other large bases, one of which is being Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. And just the other day, 5 United States Air Force refueling planes were hit and or damaged sitting on the ground. Now, the damage hasn't been reported, and I have not seen photos circulating around. Maybe some of you have. You can drop those in the comments. But if you look at this tanker laydown here, it's tough to tell from the other satellite imagery that I showed. But when you look at those tankers, they're usually not HESCO barriers or any kind of concrete barriers that are in between. You would see those revetments, usually at fighter-sized bases in the region. For instance, if you looked around Afghanistan, we'll just leave it at that. If you look around the region, you typically see big concrete revetments built up around fighters. They're smaller aircraft, much easier to do. Not saying that Prince Sultan didn't have that, but when you look at heavy aircraft, tankers, C-17s, C-130s, usually if the base has not been completely built up and fortified over the years to handle large aircraft, they might just be parked out in the open. And what that results is when you have a ballistic missile attack, if you have a drone attack, a mortar attack, that shrapnel, the fragmentation from that ordnance isn't stopped by anything other than planes, people, equipment, etc. So again, unknown how much damage was caused. They're saying that they were not destroyed. So maybe it was just some fragmentation. They'll be able to patch it up and be on their merry way. But again, a big deal. When we're talking about 5 tankers, we only have a limited number of these, and they are the backbone to operation. So this is significant. So again, we have Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Interesting fact a little bit later on about that because it's relatively new to the mix, at least lately, but it is old at the same time. Dhafra Air Base in UAE. This is home to a lot of fighters. And to me, this was interesting from the beginning of the conflict, the fact that we saw Iran going after Dubai. Remember, there's no U.S. military infrastructure when it comes to Dubai, maybe outside of a couple of attachés or personnel, but no bases, right? We're not operating fighters or bombers out of any airport in and around Dubai. But we saw the Iranians attacking symbolic buildings like hotels, flying by the Burj Khalifa, attacking the airport multiple times. We just did a video on that yesterday. So again, they weren't just missing the military base in these attacks that have been occurring inside the UAE. Going after Dubai is not a near miss, that's deliberate. So in addition to Al Dhafra, we also have the Navy support facility in Bahrain for Fifth Fleet. We've seen that come under multiple attacks. And then we've talked about Al Udeid. Well, let's not forget about Ali Salim in Kuwait. We also have bases in Jordan. And just yesterday, we saw Iran put out a message directly to Jordan, telling its people, basically, don't support the U.S. Tell your government to get the U.S. out of Jordan. Otherwise, you will become more of a target for Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, how much they're able to threaten Jordan is another question. Also, remember, these countries in the Gulf aren't democracy. So, again, when it comes to public pressure, I don't think you have as much public pressure capability than you do in some countries. That said, we've already heard the economic piece, just what's their tolerance for it and what's their reaction going to be? Is it going to be met with removing their support for the United States in order to appease Iran and to get them to stop attacking? Or is it going to be an increased escalation on their parts? And we have a lot of different factors that come into how these countries are going to fit into the puzzle piece. I definitely don't have those answers. But again, we're going to see how this plays out because, again, it's not just going away. But again, I think it's interesting to look at the history here a little bit. Prince Sultan Air Base was a big fixture for the United States for quite a while. And then following the Khobar Towers attack, that's when we saw kind of the pressure start to increase. Also, a bunch of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals. So the U.S. and Saudi Arabia basically came up to a mutual agreement to phase out Prince Sultan Air Base until 2019 when it came back. I do have a little note here. I mean, I saw it play out my last deployment in 2014 and 15 when we actually had F-16s divert into Saudi Arabia. And I'll just say this, it was impressive to see how fast we got those jets out of there and the level that it elevated to, meaning going directly to the State Department and getting some high up officials involved to get those jets quickly fixed, crews over there, and flown out of there quickly. So I thought this was an interesting piece, and I do talk about it in the newsletter, and this is from the Sofan Center, talking about Gulf states hosting U.S. bases immediately became targets for Iranian missiles. And not just those bases, as I mentioned before, right? Dubai specifically, critical and symbolic pieces of Dubai and UAE were targeted directly by Iran. We saw Iran initially apologizing, but again, I can see this as an attempt trying to drive a wedge between the Gulf states and the U.S. military and the United States just in general. But the big piece here is clearly that the U.S. military presence in the region, it was not a deterrence for Iran. Iran actually hammered away harder because the U.S. was present in these countries, or these countries supported or allowed the United States to utilize their airspace, land, territorial waters to conduct operations against Iran. So now you have obviously loss of life, you have critical infrastructure that has been targeted, with the economic impacts being vast. If we look at Dubai just alone, right, they are losing about $600 million a day, and that's really in the tourism piece. We're not talking about oil and gas, which we just talked about earlier in the video. So this begs the question, what does this look like down the road? Now, I think the ties are interwoven very deeply, not only from strategic partnerships, military partnerships, and economic partnerships, which again have so many variables and facets, I won't even begin to claim that I understand, but recognizing that this is ultimately going to put a strain on all of those. And there will be some kind of decision with the weight and balance of what is worth the return on investment when it comes to having U.S. military bases. Is the risk worth the reward? Is the risk needed in order to guarantee overall relationships or security? I don't know. Again, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down below. Is this something that happens overnight? I don't think so. But in the long term, 5-10 years down the road, what does this look like? And maybe we don't even know that yet because we don't know how this conflict is going to come to an end and what is going to be the cost that's paid for the remainder of this conflict. Again, if you're curious about this type of content, you can check out the newsletter, which that's linked down below, and I'll see you next time.